July 30th, 1944. Normandy, France. After nearly 2 months of intense fighting since landing on the beach on June 6, British forces continued to advance inland. The metallic sound of tracks, the heavy engine of tanks, and the constant smell of gunpowder set the pace of the offensive. The enemy seemed weakened. The mission was clear: advance, break through the resistance, and consolidate control over French territory. The Allied forces had successfully landed on the beaches of Normandy, facing second-line coastal defenses composed of exhausted and poorly equipped German units. However, what came after D-Day was not the rapid march to Paris that many had planned. Rural France proved to be a treacherous battlefield. The Normandy landscape, with its enclosed fields, high hedgerows, and narrow roads, known as bocage, favored the defender. Every intersection, every hill, and every small village could hide an ambush. For weeks, the British, Americans, Canadians, and Poles advanced slowly. Every meter gained required hours of combat, concentrated artillery fire, and the sacrifice of dozens of men. It was a war of attrition, a deadly green maze where heavy tanks had difficulty maneuvering and visibility was minimal. The enemy could be anywhere on either side of the fence, and often was. In the British sector, the command combined a new offensive with American operations that had already broken through the Western Front. The plan was called Operation Bluecoat, an attempt to break the balance on the battlefront and capture 2 strategic points, Hill 309 and the crossroads at Vire. The maneuver was intended to complement the U.S. advance in Operation Cobra, which was already pushing the Germans back in the west. With part of the 2nd Panzer Division deployed to contain the Americans, the British saw an opportunity. All that remained in front of them was the weakened 326th German Infantry Division. The order was straightforward: advance 10 kilometers, take control of the high ground, and cut off the German retreat routes. Among the units assigned to the operation was the 6th Guards Armored Brigade, composed of battalions made up of elite British soldiers. Many of them had originally been infantry troops and now operated tanks. The Churchill, heavy and respected machines. The Churchills were known for their robustness and ability to withstand damage that would destroy other vehicles. The Mark IV model, used in Normandy, weighed over 38 tons, was powered by a 350 horsepower engine and had 89 mm frontal armor, almost twice that of some German medium tanks. Its 75 mm main gun was effective against infantry targets and light fortification. Speed, however, was its weak point, about 8 miles per hour, or just over 12 kilometers per hour on rough terrain. It was a machine built to withstand, not to run. Among the participating regiments was the 3rd Battalion of the Scots Guards, one of the oldest and most prestigious units in the British Army. Founded in 1642, the Guards carried centuries of tradition and discipline. These were the same men who, in times of peace, guarded Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle, but who now fought amid mud, smoke, and fire in the French countryside. On the morning of July 30th, the battalion advanced under the banner of the 6th Brigade. The enemy seemed disorganized and in retreat. British artillery had cleared the way with intense bombardment, and the initial defenses were quickly overcome. Major Willie Whitelaw, commander of Squadron S, led the column on the left flank. Under his command were veterans and young recruits, all confident in the capabilities of their Churchills. The advance was too fast. The infantry forces of the 15th Scottish Division, tasked with protecting and accompanying the tanks, were left behind. The order, however, was clear: continue. Within a few hours, the Churchills had advanced about 10 kilometers into enemy territory. Alone, no direct infantry support, no flanking cover, only tanks, engines, and faith in their own armor. The mood among the crews was optimistic. Many believed that the advance signaled the collapse of the German lines. The idea that the enemy still had the capacity for an organized counterattack seemed unlikely. The enemy artillery was silent, and reports of resistance were increasingly coming from isolated positions. Everything pointed to a quick victory. The British tanks took up positions on high ground, with a partial view of the plain ahead. Major Whitelaw's S Squadron occupied the left sector, while the other squadrons lined up on the right and center. The position seemed secure. From above, it was possible to observe the open fields and secondary roads that crisscrossed the landscape. The crews made adjustments, calibrated sights, and some officers descended from their tanks for a quick briefing. What no one noticed was that, A few meters beyond the hedges, something was watching them. Three motionless silhouettes, hidden in the shadow of a row of trees, followed the Churchills' every move. Silent engines, motionless guns, crews awaiting instructions. These vehicles were unlike anything the British had faced before. That morning, the prevailing feeling was one of advance and confidence. For the men of the Scots Guards, it seemed like another step in their steady progress into the interior of France. There was no sign of organized resistance, no indication that anything could break the tense calm of that sector. The breeze carried the smell of burnt fuel and old gunpowder, but the sound of the enemy had disappeared. The British command believed that the front had been virtually broken. The tanks continued on, making their way along the small Norman roads, crossing destroyed villages and abandoned fields. Some civilians watched from a distance, others fled. The advance was steady and methodical. However, somewhere between the village and the trees, fate would change. In that seemingly controlled scenario, British forces were being watched with almost surgical precision. The sights of 3 German hunters, 3 Jagdpanthers, newly arrived in Normandy, were already fixed on their targets. The contrast was stark. On one side, the confident, armored, and slow Churchills. On the other, a new generation of armored, silent, and deadly hunting machines. None of Whitelaw's men could have imagined that, in a matter of minutes, the calm landscape of Normandy would be engulfed in fire, steel, and destruction. The clock read just after 6 p.m. The brigade had gained territory, partially accomplished its objectives, and appeared to be consolidating its positions. The major was preparing a quick meeting for the group of officers. Some tanks had their engines turned off, others kept their turrets turned eastward. The scene was common for any unit in reorganization, but it was also the exact moment when confidence would turn into vulnerability. The enemy, hidden among the trees, was just waiting for the signal. In a few minutes, the Churchills would cease to be hunters and become targets. While the British tanks adjusted their positions on the uneven terrain, on the other side of the line, in the shadows of a strip of trees and hedges, the Germans were preparing. 3 heavy silhouettes, low profile and angular in structure, waited motionless. They were Jagdpanthers, armored hunters newly introduced on the Western Front. For the British, they were still an unknown presence. For the Germans, they were one of the last hopes of containing the Allied advance in Normandy. The Jagdpanther, officially designated Ad KFSE 173, was a direct result of German experience with Panther tanks. In 1943, after several failed attempts to create an effective tank destroyer, German engineers combined the Panther chassis with the most feared anti-tank gun on the front, the 8.8 cm PaK 43-3 L71, the same used in the King Tiger. The result was a machine with an aggressive profile and exceptional destructive power. The front armor, sloped at 55 degrees, was 80 mm thick, capable of withstanding almost all Allied projectiles. On the sides, the 50 mm steel was also reinforced by a slope, which increased its ability to deflect direct hits. With a crew of 5, commander, gunner, loader, driver, and radio operator, the vehicle offered total protection within a fully enclosed structure, unlike conventional tanks. Powered by a 700-horsepower Maybach HL230P30 engine, the Jagdpanther combined speed, mobility, and firepower in a ratio that few Allied machines could match. Its low silhouette made it difficult to detect from a distance, and its cannon could destroy a Churchill before it was even spotted. On that afternoon of July 30th, 3 of these vehicles, belonging to Panzerjäger Abteilung 654, had been carefully positioned around the village of Les Loges. The unit commander, experienced in ambushes on the Eastern Front, chose the location with precision. The vegetation-covered hills, tall hedges, and narrow valleys of Normandy provided natural camouflage. The large, heavy British tanks moved slowly, exposing themselves in open fields. The ambush was a matter of time. Meanwhile, Major Willie Whitelaw, commander of Squadron S of the Scots Guards, observed the terrain ahead of his position. The radio transmitted short, technical communication. The latest orders received indicated that the advance should continue after regrouping. The major did not know that he was being watched through sights adjusted to a few meters from his position. The German crews waited for authorization to open fire. The instructions were simple: attack from the flank, use vegetation as cover, and avoid prolonged exposure. The priority was to hit the command tanks and paralyze the British column. Inside each Jagdpanther, the silence was absolute. interrupted only by the metallic sound of the cannon being loaded and the crew's restrained breathing. To the British soldiers, the atmosphere seemed calm. The distant sound of artillery had diminished. Some officers had dismounted from their Churchills for a quick meeting in the field. The terrain was uneven, with small dips and marshy areas. Visibility was limited. Even so, the general feeling was one of control. The German force seemed disintegrated, and the advance seemed secure. But on the left flank of the British formation, danger was slowly approaching. Whitelaw's squadron had advanced too far and left a gap in their flank. The Jagdpanthers, well hidden among trees and bushes, had an ideal field of fire. The average distance varied between 400 and 600 meters, perfect for the 8.8 cm cannon, which could pierce the hull of a Churchill as if it were paper. The first Jagdpanther adjusted its sights. Inside the cabin, the gunner adjusted the range and whispered a single word: "Bereit, ready." The commander responded with a brief "Feuer frei." The shot echoed across the fields with a sharp crack. The shell flew through the air and hit the first Churchill on the left flank. The explosion was immediate. A flash lit up the field, and the British tank's turret was partially torn off. The other crew members, confused, tried to respond. Before they could react, the second Jagdpanther opened fire. Within seconds, another Churchill was hit, followed by a third. The attack had begun with surgical precision. The British, taken by surprise, tried to maneuver through the smoke. Major Whitelaw ordered all tanks to close in and return fire, but the terrain and positioning made any attempt difficult. The sound of the Churchill engines tried to drown out the roar of the Jagdpanthers. The gunner of one of the British tanks fired a rapid sequence of 75mm shells, which hit the vegetation near the enemy position. One of the impacts grazed the front hull of a Jagdpanther, without causing any real damage. The response was immediate. A new German shot pierced the British tank from side to side. The attack was coordinated. While two Jagdpanthers covered the frontal fire, the third advanced slowly, changing position to confuse the British line. With each shot, an Allied tank was immobilized. In less than 2 minutes, Squadron S had already lost 10 Churchills. The battalion's second in command was hit directly. The explosion ripped the turret off his vehicle and threw debris several meters. The psychological impact was devastating. The soldiers inside the surviving tanks struggled to identify where the shots were coming from. The closed terrain and smoke made visibility difficult. Many believed they were under attack from multiple units, when in reality only 3 Jagdpanthers were operating. Amid the chaos, the brigade headquarters radio recorded interrupted transmission, voices cut off by interference and static. Communications with Squadron S were lost for several long minutes. The rest of the British formation, unaware of the magnitude of the attack, believed it was enemy heavy artillery. When the fire ceased, the battlefield was covered in smoke and debris. In just 2 minutes of combat, 11 British tanks had been destroyed or severely damaged. The Germans, having achieved their objective of neutralizing the flank, retreated immediately, disappearing among the trees of the bocage. Squadron S was practically destroyed. Only 4 Churchills remained operational. Major Whitelaw, stunned, reorganized what remained of his forces. The silence that followed was heavy, interrupted only by the crackling of fire and the hissing of burning engines. The tanks that were still moving collected the wounded and transmitted fragmented reports to the command. Behind the scenes, information about the attack began to circulate rapidly among the British units of the 6th Brigade. The enemy had used a new type of armored vehicle, faster, lower and more deadly than anything seen before. The name would soon spread among the soldiers: Jagdpanther. The British offensive did not cease, but the confidence that had marked the beginning of Operation Bluecoat began to crumble. The commanders knew that, from that day on, the Battle of Normandy would never be the same. The record of that encounter was marked as one of the first direct confrontations between British Churchills and German Jagdpanthers, a clash that would reveal the tactical and technological superiority of German hunters in open terrain. From then on, Allied reports began to warn of the risk of advancing without infantry support and the need to identify ambush positions in advance. As the dust settled over the fields of Les Loges, the surviving crews were still trying to understand what had happened. The tanks, once a symbol of resistance, had been hunted down with surgical precision, and in the shadows, the Jagdpanthers disappeared, leaving only traces of metal, smoke, and destruction. You can now check if you have already subscribed to our channel so we can continue together. And so the attack had lasted less than 2 minutes, but its effects would be remembered for much longer. When the echo of the gunfire ceased and the smoke began to dissipate over the fields of Les Loges, the scene was one of complete destruction. The Scots Guards' S Squadron, which hours earlier had advanced confidently, was now reduced to burnt wreckage, twisted hulls, and the tense silence of stunned survivors. The coordinated attack by the 3 Jagdpanthers had struck the British line with surgical precision, halting any attempt at reorganization. Radio communications were compromised. The British artillery, unclear about what had happened, hesitated to react. Some tanks, still operational, attempted to retreat, maneuvering with difficulty among the destroyed vehicles. In many cases, the hit Churchills were on fire, with hatches melting and internal ammunition exploding in sequence. The heat was intense. Black smoke rose in columns visible for miles. Major Willie Whitelaw, still in command, ordered the immediate withdrawal of the remaining tanks. Only 4 vehicles were in working order. The rest had been destroyed or severely damaged. The surviving crew members began to evacuate the wounded, improvising cover with what remained of the Churchill carcasses. Later reports would indicate that each Jagdpanther had fired less than 10 shots, enough to annihilate almost an entire formation. During the following minutes, the Germans remained absolutely silent. The Jagdpanthers, following the standard tactic of attack and disappear, began to move slowly northward, using the trees and hills as cover. The German commander, satisfied with the result, knew that remaining in the same position would mean attracting retaliatory fire. The retreat was planned and methodical. Each vehicle advanced alternately, covering the movement of the other. Within minutes, the British completely lost visual contact. For the command of the 6th Guards Tank Brigade, the news was received with bewilderment. The initial report stated, "Heavy artillery and unknown tank attack." The description of the explosions and the pattern of destruction did not match the attacks of ordinary Panzer IVs or Tigers. The torn-off turrets and hulls pierced from side to side suggested the use of a large-caliber cannon, something capable of easily penetrating the front armor of a Churchill. British officers realized they were facing a new type of opponent. Until then, reports of the Jagdpanther had been scarce. Allied intelligence knew of its existence, but there was no record of direct confrontation. What happened that day was the first confirmed encounter between British tanks and this new German weapon. As the fire subsided, the field turned into a search and rescue scene. Medical and mechanical teams began to comb through the destroyed lines. Burnt-out tanks were opened with hand tools in an attempt to rescue survivors. At every turn, impact marks were visible, clean circular holes in the armor, indicating the penetrating power of the 88mm gun. The most experienced soldiers immediately recognized the pattern. It was the same weaponry used on the Tiger II. Reports indicate that the first Churchill hit exploded before the crew could react. The impact of a single high-caliber shell had ignited the ammunition compartment. The second tank was hit in the flank, immobilizing it before receiving a second shot that destroyed it completely. The third and fourth were hit almost simultaneously, their turrets thrown off the main structure. One of the command tanks had its turret completely torn off. The impact was so violent that it landed more than 20 meters from the hull. The men who managed to escape reported that it felt like an attack from all sides. In fact, the 3 Jagdpanthers operated in a 600-meter arc, alternating positions with each shot. This technique confused the target and created the illusion of a much larger number of enemies. Each shot was followed by a short, precise maneuver, with the German vehicles retreating, adjusting their aim, and attacking again. The British tried to respond with suppressive fire. Some Churchills fired 75mm shells at the vegetation from which the shots were coming, but to no avail. The Jagdpanthers' sloped armor deflected most of the impacts. Even when a British shell hit one of the German hunters, the result was only a ricochet that left a superficial mark. In a short time, the battlefield was transformed into a steel graveyard. When units of the 15th Scottish Division finally reached the position, they found dozens of smoldering wrecks. The supporting infantry had fallen far behind and arrived too late to alter the course of the fight. Squadron S was virtually destroyed. Official British records report that the attack took place around 6:10 p.m. and ended at 6:12 p.m., exactly 2 minutes of fire. During that time, 11 Allied tanks were destroyed or severely damaged, 10 directly by the Jagdpanthers and 1 by enemy artillery. On the German side, no losses were confirmed at that moment. The destruction of the Churchills had an immediate effect on British operations in the region. The 6th Armoured Brigade was forced to suspend its advance for reorganization. The left flank, which was supposed to protect the advance toward Hill 309, was left vulnerable. German forces took advantage of the interval to reposition their defenses and reinforce their retreat routes. Over the next few hours, the British sent out reconnaissance patrols to identify the exact point of origin of the fire. The terrain, however, made any analysis difficult. The German hunters had disappeared. Only tracks and metal fragments indicated their passage. At the end of the day, Major Whitelaw's report was forwarded to the High Command. It contained a cold and precise summary of the disaster. The enemy employed heavy, sloped armor vehicles equipped with 88mm cannons. The tanks were hit in sequence. Estimated combat time, 2 minutes. Effects, devastating. Human losses were significant. Many crew members were unable to escape the explosion. Others were rescued with severe burns and injuries. The British artillery, without visual confirmation, avoided counterattacking so as not to hit their own forces. When night fell, the field was lit only by the flames of the still-burning tanks. The remaining soldiers set up an improvised defensive perimeter, fearing another attack. No further shots were fired. The German action had been swift, efficient, and precise, the classic model of an ambush in bocage terrain. The clash on July 30th would officially mark the first documented appearance of the Jagdpanthers on the Western Front. For the British, it was a brutal introduction to a war machine that combined power, protection, and refined tactics. For the Germans, it was a demonstration of what the new equipment was capable of when used under ideal terrain conditions. During the early hours of the morning, the Allied command organized the collection of the remaining vehicles and the recovery of the wounded. Engineers and mechanics were sent to assess the wreckage. One of the British tanks, partially burned, was towed away and examined later. The perforations in the front armor confirmed the use of 88mm shells, irrefutable evidence of the presence of Jagdpanthers. The battle for Les Loges was only a minor episode in the Normandy campaign, but its technical and tactical importance would be recognized in the days that followed. The British Army would review its advance protocols and reinforce the need for infantry support in armored operations. When the sun rose the next morning, the field was covered in thick fog. Among the burned-out tanks, rescue crews were still working silently. It was the end of one of the fastest and deadliest ambushes of the campaign, a reminder that in mechanized warfare, the difference between confidence and destruction could fit into just 2 minutes of accurate fire. In the early hours of the next day, the 6th Guards Armored Brigade began reconnaissance operations in the area of the attack. The priority was to assess the extent of the damage, rescue the wounded, and try to identify the exact positions from which the enemy had fired. The scene they encountered confirmed the destructive power of the previous afternoon's confrontation. The ground was littered with the wreckage of Churchill tanks, charred carcasses, and craters left by direct hits. Amid the still thick smoke, military engineers carefully followed the tracks left on the ground, trying to understand the trajectory of the enemy vehicles. The first clues appeared at the side of the field. Wide, deep marks indicated the movement of heavy tracks, different from those left by conventional German tanks. The metal tracks led towards an orchard area, partially destroyed by the bombing. The team advanced cautiously, knowing that the enemy could have left traps or camouflaged vehicles. After a few hours of inspection, they found the first concrete trace, a burned-out, partially destroyed Jagdpanther. The vehicle was tilted, with the left side riddled with marks, and the engine completely burned out. The impact on the ground indicated that the crew had abandoned the armored vehicle before setting fire to the interior. The tank had probably suffered damage to its tracks or transmission system during the retreat. None of the bodies were found nearby, suggesting that the Germans had managed to evacuate the site. This discovery was recorded as the British's first physical contact with the enemy's new tank destroyer model. The recovery team continued to advance, following the tracks of the other two machines. About 800 meters ahead, on a narrow country road, the British found what would be the most significant discovery of the operation. Next to a small railway station, partially destroyed by the fighting, was a second Jagdpanther, this time virtually intact. The vehicle was immobilized, with one of its tracks broken and its rollers damaged, but its structure remained solid. The hatches were open, and the interior was empty. The engine still smelled of burnt fuel, and there was evidence that the crew had abandoned the tank in a hurry. For British engineers, this represented a rare opportunity. For the first time, they could closely examine one of the most advanced vehicles in the German arsenal. The armored vehicle was immediately cordoned off. Technicians and officers took turns documenting every detail: armor thickness, crew position, sighting system, types of ammunition stored, and engine components. The 8 semi-porter gun was still loaded, with an armor-piercing shell ready to fire. This level of preservation was unusual in a combat scenario. The vehicle was designated for full recovery and, with the assistance of the 6th Brigade's Heavy Recovery Section, began to be removed under the protection of infantry troops. The rescue operation was slow and meticulous. The weight of the Jagdpanther, about 46 tons, required the use of 2 Churchill ARV armored tractors for towing. During the journey, the British vehicles faced unstable ground and mined areas. Nevertheless, the specimen was successfully transported to an advanced base north of Caumont-Levante. There, intelligence specialists and armor engineers were able to conduct a detailed analysis. The reports prepared in the following days highlighted several technical aspects. The Jagdpanther's sloped frontal armor was a significant innovation, capable of deflecting projectiles and increasing resistance without adding excessive weight. The main gun, the same used in the King Tiger, had exceptional range and accuracy, capable of destroying any Allied armored vehicle at over 1,500 meters. The interior, although compact, demonstrated efficient engineering, with ventilation and communication systems superior to the standards seen in other German models. British engineers were particularly impressed with the balance between power, mobility, and protection. The vehicle combined the characteristics of a heavy tank with the agility of a light tank destroyer. This combination made it a formidable opponent on any type of terrain. The recovered vehicle was later sent to Great Britain for further testing, contributing directly to the improvement of Allied armored vehicles in the following months. Meanwhile, on the battlefield, the 6th Guards Armored Brigade was reorganizing its forces. Squadron S, which had been virtually destroyed, was temporarily withdrawn from the front line. The remaining units began to operate with greater infantry and aerial reconnaissance support, trying to avoid further ambushes in closed terrain. The lesson was immediate. Never again would a British armored advance in Normandy take place without adequate cover. The Jagdpanthers' action at Les Loges was documented in detail in military reports. The performance of the 3 German vehicles, which destroyed 11 Churchills in just 2 minutes without any confirmed losses, was recognized as one of the most accurate armored attacks of the campaign. Despite the momentary defeat, the British managed to gain a valuable strategic advantage: direct access to the new enemy model and knowledge of the tactics employed. In the following days, the Operation Bluecoat offensive continued, but with greater caution. The British command adjusted its strategies and reinforced air support near the tank columns. The incident served as a warning about the dangers of isolated advances and the importance of prior reconnaissance of the terrain. Although the confrontation was costly, it provided crucial information about the technological power that Germany still possessed at that stage of the war. The captured Jagdpanther became a centerpiece of study and was later displayed in military museums as a milestone in the evolution of mechanized warfare. Every detail of that vehicle, from the design of the armor to the efficiency of the cannon, was thoroughly analyzed to understand how a handful of machines could cause such destruction in such a short time. Today, this episode is remembered not only for the devastation it caused, but for the historical and technical importance of the encounter. The clash between the British Churchills and the German Jagdpanthers accurately illustrates the transition from mechanized warfare to an era in which technology, strategy, and terrain defined the survival of each unit in combat. With the end of fighting in the region, the British finally consolidated control over the western sector of Normandy. The scars of that battle, however, remained visible for a long time. Craters scattered across the fields, rusting tank wreckage among the hedgerows, and memories recorded in official reports. What could have been different that afternoon? Should the orders have been more cautious? Should the advance have waited for the infantry? Or was the outcome inevitable given the technical superiority of the Jagdpanthers? Leave your opinion in the comments on what, in your view, could have changed the outcome of this ambush. If you enjoyed this historical content and want to continue following other detailed reconstructions of real World War II battles, like this video, share it with those who appreciate military history, and subscribe to the channel now so you don't miss the next analysis.